podcast. This is podcast number 2, Tony. Look at us go. And Tony, that's a nice jumper. Where'd you get that jumper from?
She got it from Japan.
Okay.
So for starters, I think it's actually a women's jumper because I couldn't read the words. It's the most expensive jumper I own. So speaking of buying shiny things, I bought it literally because it was shiny. I'm not sure if you can tell, but it's a terrible jumper. It keeps peeling. You know, the little bits and pieces keep coming off. But I wear it because it's expensive, and I thought I'd keep wearing it until it dies.
Yeah.
But
Good.
ironically, I'm not even sure it's a men's jumper, but it looks nice.
Well, hopefully it appreciates in value. That's what we want to hear about.
Well, once it's been on me, you can sell it, and it'll come with a signed copy of this is Tony's
perfect.
jumper. All right, so I think at the end of the last podcast, I was hoping, and this is for someone who don't really know what's happening, and you have all the data. So for the listeners and maybe viewers who wants to see my jumper, what I always want to know, a couple of things: what in the world was going on in Perth, and what is going to happen in Melbourne. So if we can start with Perth, because I was looking at, what was it, like 5 years ago, its average price was 400,000, and now it's closing to 900K. It's just outrageous to me what's happening there. What is happening?
Well, people don't realise that Perth is quite cyclical. It's probably one of the most cyclical and, probably easiest markets to read. And basically, if you look at the long-term kind of performance of Perth, and we might actually show a slide of this, but, 1982, you had the cash rate. Do you know what the cash rate was back in 1982, Tony?
You're asking me your questions. It must be either really high or really low. 17%?
Oh, you're pretty close, 16.3. So the cash rate back then, what was inflation? What do you think the inflation number was back then?
Oh, the cash rate was so high, inflation must be.
We had a severe recession. Things were really, really bad in 82.
Inflation, I don't know, like 9, 10?
Yeah, 12.4%. So you're not far off.
Okay.
Pretty good guess. And unemployment, what do you think back then? 1982, we haven't quite hit the crash yet. What do you think?
So what are we now at? 3%-ish?
Yeah.
I mean, don't know, 8?
11.3. So this was...
Okay, they all sound terrible.
So this was 82. So from 82 to 1990, there was very little growth in the Perth market. And then from 91, we had our next major recession. The cash rate was 8.5. Inflation was 4.8. Unemployment, funnily enough, was the same number in 91 than it was in 82. And then you had this period of really strong growth from, say, 2000 to 2008, and capital values went up quite dramatically over that period. And then from 2008 all the way to kind of 2016, 17, when you were probably looking in Perth, we had no growth. So if you bought a little terrace in Subiaco for, say, $800,000 back in 2008, you would have made no growth over that, say, 10-year period. So it did terribly over that 10 to 15-year period. So Perth really bottomed out in 17, 18, if you look at the long-term cycles. And, we started to see evidence. Do you know what the vacancy rate back in Perth was in 2018, when it was probably just about bottomed out?
Sorry, just for those who are unaware, so vacancy rate means what percentage of houses are...
How many vacant properties were on the residential market at the time? What percentage? So a good vacancy rate where you're going to see rents rising is sub 2%. And you're going to see rents starting to move. So if you've got a vacancy rate within any capital city sub 2%, you should see rents starting to increase. Now, the vacancy rates across all capital cities are sub 2% currently. So this is going to be the year of the rent rise. But the vacancy rate back then was almost 7-8%. So, which is
right,
very high. You couldn't rent out anything. Properties were staying vacant for 3 or 4 months. Things were really dire back then. Then what we saw in 18, 19, the vacancy rate started to come back. So they went from 6% down to 4%, down to 3%. So we started to see rents rising because of the, obviously, incoming interstate migration. So back in, really, if we saw the real bottom of the market, 2019-20 was the probably real bottom. Then obviously Mr. McGowan, our lovely Premier of WA, he came in and said, We want to see you saw these heavy amounts of interstate migrants moving in. So everyone from Victoria had had enough of the Victorian government, and they're saying, right, they started opening up. Obviously, COVID occurred, but there were job opportunities occurring in WA. So you had 70,000 interstate migrants that started to move from the east coast of Australia into Perth. Now, during that period, the vacancy rate went down to 1.5%. So rents were dramatically increasing. There wasn't enough stock on the market. Then all of a sudden, when we had this last conversation a few years ago, you could actually go and buy a really good quality terrace in Perth or a house for $700,000 back in 2019. Do you know what that same property is worth, say, in East Vic Park now? Do you know Perth that well? Como, Kensington, North Perth, next to the hospital there.
Yeah, bits and pieces. I don't know. You're going to tell me it's at least doubled.
Yeah. So over that period, prices have risen by between 70 and 100%. So if you bought a property back then, the problem is with Perth, the housing market is gone on such a significant run. We're probably 3/4 of the way through its growth phase. There's still a little bit of growth left in the housing market. But I think if you are looking to buy a long-term asset in Perth within your investment portfolio, I'd be suggesting that you're probably nearing towards the end of its run in terms of capital value. If we had this conversation 3 or 4 years ago, you would have done quite well. So there was a lot of heavy amounts of investment activity occurring in Perth. We purchased in excess of 1,000 properties over that period over there. We had a really great run. But they're getting to the point where there's been a lot of equity that's been built up in those particular assets. The Perth housing market probably has another 2 to 3 years to run, but it's not going to have the same growth that it probably occurred over the last 5 years. The vacancy rate over there is still down at 0.5%, so it's really low. So rents are still rising. If we get an upcoming interest rate cut, which there's obviously a lot of talk about that, it might push prices up even further. But from our end, clients and our doctors that are looking to pay down debt on their family homes in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, that have more than $1 million worth of debt on their homes, over the next 12 to 24 months, it's probably a good time to exit those particular assets, pay off your debt on your family home, and then go again, look at the next market. So if you look at we'll share this graph on the podcast, but if you look at the industry breakdown everyone's been worried about Perth because it's so mining dominated. Mining made up for almost 55% of the entire workforce 15 years ago. Do you know what it's running at now? 30.9%. So when you're looking at a market, you need to actually understand the different types of industries behind it. Because we love, we've always built these portfolios and helped our doctors. We love healthcare industries and we love the education industries. So anywhere next to a university or hospital predominantly, know that you're going to get good rental income during that period. And in times of downturn, you've actually got good rental income coming on that particular asset or area, if you can buy next to those two industries.
So you mentioned Perth is very cyclical and almost easy to predict. Is that because of mining? Or
yes.
Why is it that way?
Yeah, because if you look at Perth, it's very reliant on the price of the iron ore price. When the iron ore price goes up, the likelihood of property values going up, because it had such a reliance on mining and different types of mining activities over there. Energy is the new one coming through. They're talking about different types of energy that are, hydrogen and all different types of things being introduced. But when the price of iron ore went up, prices went up. When it went down, so it's very, we've got a data set that is clearly aligned to the price of iron ore prices. And anyone that tells you that it isn't related to iron ore prices, that is one of the key demand drivers that we always assess as a market for Perth and looking at house values over there.
So potentially what's happening, China's economy starting to plateau, what's happening in America, maybe there's a reduction in need for iron.
Tariffs. Yep.
So all of those things affects Perth a lot more than it, let's say, affects Melbourne or Sydney.
Correct. And see,
right, okay.
See the Sydney and Melbourne industries have a lot more financial services. So in times of GFC, when we saw back in 2008, you had over 30% of the entire workforce in Sydney is come from financial services or insurance related type industries. So when you have a GFC, there's going to be an opportunity there to actually start buying well. So if you understand the cycles a little bit more, there are certain times that, and we went into the Sydney market and purchased over that period after the GFC, all the Macquarie bankers and rich bankers that weren't receiving their big bonuses. They had to exit out of their Paddington terraces back then. And, we were telling our doctors back then to go and buy those particular terraces. And they were $800,000, $900,000 back then. Do you know what they're worth now?
6 million.
$3 to $5 million.
Yeah.
And these are little terraces on 150 square meters of land. They've got rising damp. You've got to fix the plumbing. They're very small, but the thing is, the location has driven the value of that asset. So there are opportunities to get into Sydney, and like Perth, there are opportunities to get into Perth. And that moment in Perth for housing was back in 2019-20. We're still buying the odd asset, but I think it's the lower value asset. So it's the apartment dwelling stock, it's the townhouse stock, it's the villa type stock. Because house prices have got on such a run, it's the entry-level stock that is now going to be the best performing asset on the ground in Perth. And that'll it'll get pushed up in terms of the capital value. So in answer to your question, I think units, townhouses and villas are far better value right now than, to buy a good quality house in Perth, within a 10-kilometre radius of the CBD, it's going to cost you $1 to $2 million.
Right. Essentially, the run is it's starting to slow.
Yes.
But still a couple of years left.
We think the market's got another 20 to 30% to run, but the opportune time or the best time was to get into Perth from 19 to 22.
Just for my own understanding, so you mentioned there's, low vacancy rates, and then obviously when there's not enough houses, the rent goes up, which makes sense to me. And it sounds like Perth is, as if someone who lives there, it's just like a terrible place to try and find a rental property right now.
It is. It's not.
So how does that actually increase the house prices? Like, does that mean more people are more likely? So I'm trying to work it through in my head. Like, how does rent affect house prices?
Yeah, so there's a few things. You've got to look at the amount of overseas migrants going in, the interstate migrants going in, and then natural births. So that's one driver in terms of looking at the demand. The other demand driver, or the other thing you need to assess, is the amount of dwellings being built within that market. And this is not just a Perth issue. This is a national issue. We've had the government trying to introduce these 1.2 million homes being built. We are nowhere near reaching that metric. So if you've got a falling vacancy rate within that residential market and there's not enough stock to cater for the demand, the key metric that I look at is days on market. Do you know what the days on market metric is in Perth at the moment for houses and units?
It must be extremely low.
Yeah, exactly. So it's 9 days. So
9 days.
Once you list a property, so if you're
it gets sold the week after.
Correct. So if you put the property on the market, it's literally sold. And that's for...
Oh my God.
So average days on market for houses, it's 10 days. And for units, even units, it's 11 days. 3 months ago, it was 9 days. And a normal market, do you know what the average days on market in Melbourne is, for example?
Oh,
it's 34. It's 34.
Right.
So when you see, and do you know how many available properties are on the market at the moment in Perth?
If everything's going so quickly, I'll presume not that many for a big city.
Yeah, so there's 13,000 dwellings on the market for sale. So there's not enough stock currently on the market. There's not enough rental stock on the market. So it's the perfect sort of storm. When you see a market growing, the first trigger mechanism you see is rental growth occurring. And then house price growth follows that rental growth.
If the rental is so low, why aren't developers building more houses? And the house prices going up?
That is a great question because developers can't actually afford to build the product. So the cost of materials, the cost of construction, the planning process, and we're getting into another whole completely different topic here. But I actually think if, Perth's planning laws in terms of getting residential developments through are actually better in comparison to Melbourne and Sydney. To go and build something in Melbourne, in terms of the process that you need to go through, I really feel for developers out there that are full-time developers trying to build an owner-occupier product. So from my end, it's the cost of construction and the replacement cost of replacing that particular asset versus building it. And there's a big arbitrage there because it costs you maybe $700,000 or $800,000 to build that 2 or 3 bedroom apartment in Perth. And if you can pick it up for 500 or 600, there's going to be a natural growth.
Right.
There's still good opportunities in Perth, but at the lower sub 1 mil market. In the housing sector, I think, there's probably better markets to take a position on right now, would be our view.
So going back to what we talk about in sort of episode 2, so if you're like a junior doctor living in Melbourne or Sydney, earning, okay wages, definitely better than average, Perth with, those lower units is something that you could
absolutely
consider.
Yeah. I think that would be an excellent opportunity to buy a villa between, say, 650 and 900. And I think there's even an argument in Melbourne now, and we'll talk about that on the next podcast, that there's a replacement value or replacement cost discussion that is now coming on top of the heavy amounts of overseas migrants coming into Melbourne and Sydney. In Melbourne, we're seeing a significant number of overseas migrants coming in. We don't have any accommodation. We actually can't even rent the current population.
Last question on replacement costs. Let's say a house in Perth cost $1 million to build, including land.
Yep.
And let's say at the moment you can only sell for $1 million. So why would anyone build? Is that
correct? That is my point.
Right.
So for this is one of the key reasons why you saw so many house builders across Australia going broke, because a lot of them during COVID locked in fixed price contracts on these new builds. And a lot of our doctors actually got stung as a result of this. And, the Porter Davises of this world and, these particular large builders, because they'd locked in their fixed price contracts, their materials couldn't come in, their construction, they couldn't get trades to turn up on site. There was a real lack, and obviously those costs escalated over that period. And all of a sudden it started sending all of these builders broke. So if you're a builder out there, I really feel for the builders that are out there, the smaller and mid-tier ones, developers, we need new product as well. I'm not anti-development, but I do think Australia needs other forms of new development, as long as it's built well and catered towards owner-occupiers rather than pure investors. I've seen a lot of people lose money on off-the-plan type assets. We don't buy off the plan. We never have as a business. And that's probably another topic we can talk about.
That explains, because I was always wondering, like, how in the world in a rising property market can builders go broke? Like, they should be just raking in them, but obviously with that fixed contract, then they're in trouble.
Planning and cost of materials and their ability to actually make a margin.
And like you said, I think, because, I grew up in China, and most people, and this is all over the world really, live in apartments. But our apartments in Asia is fit for purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have reasonable apartments with public facilities, parks nearby, schools. And in Australia, it feels like you just plump in a tall building and expect people to move in. It's a completely different mindset.
And you are spot on. We moving forward long term, Australians need to get used to apartment living, and we need to almost change the way in terms of how we live. But that's obviously a topic that, we can discuss 10 years down. But the Sydney unit market is very mature. It's probably the most mature apartment market because it's so dense, and you simply can't afford to build a house within, 2 kilometers of the Sydney CBD because it's too expensive. So what happens when a market becomes too expensive and people want to live in that particular area? They go and live in an apartment. So as a nation, we need to mature and we need to think differently in terms of how we live. But, telling an Aussie out there that they can't have their 700 square meters of land, within, eastern suburbs of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, they can't all live in Dalkeith or Peppermint Grove. We just have to change our view in terms of how we live. But that's another topic for another day.
Right. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts about Melbourne. Thanks. That is very insightful about Perth. And that is, and it just blew my mind. Again, you explained why that property developers are going bust, but it kind of makes sense now. Thanks everyone for joining in. Stay on and let's get on to talking about Melbourne.
Great.